Welcome to episode 91 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's #1 open source film and digital photography podcast. My name is Mike Ekman, and we are back with yet another exciting episode. And the last episode, we had meant to have our Cameras of the 90s episode, but our schedule got screwed up. And instead, we had a thrilling conversation with Jeff and Gabe from the I Dream of Cameras podcast. So this, our 91st episode, we decided to try again and dedicate the entire show to cameras of the decade of grunge and dial-up internet. Or, if you prefer, cameras of the 1890s, the last decade before air travel was invented. Joining us tonight are our usual hosts, Anthony, Theo, Paul, and Steven. But rather than make you all wait through our silly introductions, I can see the waiting room is filling up, so let's get started. Welcome back, Will Pinkham, Miles Libak, and AJ Gentile. How you guys doing?
Good.
Great on my side.
We went 6 weeks without a show, and then the last one we kind of just did like last second with Jeff and Gabe because we've been trying to talk to them we actually started talking before Christmas, and then we agreed let's just wait till after the holidays. So we were going to do something in January, and then the fires came, so then that kind of got pushed, and it was just sort of like whenever they're both available.
I was so hoping to see that as open source.
I know that seems to happen with us when we go a long time without a show. We tend to like to start back up, and we didn't want to risk losing our mojo in front of our two biggest fans. So we wanted to show them how a real podcast is run.
We didn't want to limit and hinder Jeff in any way. Right. He's such a shy, introverted type person.
He may not have spoken if he felt too intimidated.
No, we really had to gentle him down. And
no, but one of the reasons was because he read one of the emails in their prestigious mailbag or whatever from one of my buddies here in Montreal, and he massacred the poor guy's name. So I wanted to tell him how to pronounce it.
Oh no, was it Goldstein?
No, it was his name is he has a French name. His name is Gaetan. And he's like Gaetan. He did like 3 or 4 different.
Do you fluently speak French?
I'm Anglophone, but I've been here for 50 years. So yes, I do. I can say I can speak fluently French. My classes I give are actually 90% in French.
Okay.
Just one last reference back to Jeff and Gabe is we've taken the person that writes all the letters to them. Alan Perez actually sent us a mail this time. He did. So yes. So I'm not sure we're leaving him much to work with if we take Alan as well.
we have completely sucked the life out of their show, unfortunately. I mean, we probably should let them have a little bit, though, because it is kind of nice to have fans, people who really admire to us and throw, little like roses at our feet when we walk by. So we probably shouldn't beat them down too much. But here we are. So episode 91, maybe we'll just skip cameras released in the year 1990. But we had a streak of 70, 80, and we thought 90 would be our 90s episode. But, whatever. There's no real rules when it comes to doing these shows. Without thinking really hard, I think all of us are kind of similar in the regard that we like cameras of all eras. But I really love the mechanical cameras of the 50s, the 60s, the ones that don't require batteries, the ones with the clockwork, the little tick, 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 the slow speed governors. There's just something cathartic about touching, feeling, hearing, using an old camera. However, all of us here like to use cameras too. And when it comes to some of the most usable, powerful cameras, I was surprised when I really started looking at what was made in the 90s, how many of the cameras from the 90s I do really like. And, we also talk about cameras that are nearing the end of their useful life and become difficult to repair. And unfortunately, that decade is full of a lot of models like that too. So I set aside, I won't throw them out up front at the beginning because I want everybody else to share their favorite cameras too. But I picked one camera from the 90s from each of the major manufacturers that I have. Unfortunately, no Leicas. I do not own any 90s Leicas because they are beyond my budget. But I have a nice little selection next to me. We'll kind of go around as something comes up. Maybe we'll share some models that some other people maybe wouldn't have been their first choice or anything like that. But just, like we have in the past too, talk about what was great about that decade. What were some new advancements? What are some of the most usable models? And as an added bonus, that was well within the time Paul was running his store. Steven, you used to work at a store too, but 90s is probably still too early for you, right?
Yeah, I started in 2002, but we were still clearing out some of the cameras of the 90s in those days.
Okay. So yeah, some of the 90s were left over and still being sold new old stock, or were probably hot commodities on the gently used stand that I know a lot of stores would usually have. But I'll let anybody else who wants to get started, like, just talk about what they were shooting in the 90s and what are some of their models then, or even today.
When we decided we were going to do this, it was interesting to me because there was the period from the late to mid to late 80s into the 90s. The big deal was the accessibility of photography for people that weren't really tyros. With all the point and shoot cameras that came out, single use cameras became a big thing. I mean, everybody had cameras. Here's one for the Lakeshore Railroad that gave you when you got on board, and Fun Saver cameras for the Super Bowl. The Heineken camera. I mean, single-use cameras were a big deal. And the thing that drove the single-use cameras and made the manufacturers really get into it was the advent of the mini lab, because you no longer went to a drugstore and dropped off your film, and if you were really lucky, in a week or 10 days, you came back to get them. As early as the 70s, Photomat had kiosks in parking lots where you would drop your film off and you'd come back and pick them up in a few days. But in the early 90s, the mini labs became just a huge presence in the photo industry, and it made people take more pictures. Up until that point, there was an industry study that said that the average family had like 10 or 12 rolls of undeveloped film in a drawer at their house. And when mini labs came about, that all changed. That people began to shoot more pictures and get it. Yeah, there's Mike holding up his undeveloped film. It became more of a situation where people were actually going out to take pictures, and the single-use cameras had a big part of that. Also, during the 90s was really the advent of the lens shutter autofocus cameras. There have been lens shutter cameras for a long time, of course, with the Yashicas and the Canon G3s and all those. But in the 90s, the autofocus part of it became really a critical part, because it took it was like making it accessible to everyone. You didn't have to be a trained photographer to get good family pictures. So the 90s were really a very important period in photography. Just as the Argus C3 was, I guess, every man's camera back in that period, the autofocus point and shoot cameras became the same thing beginning in the 90s and following right up logically into APS and then into digital.
What I remember, because I was born in 78, so like I don't have any real awareness of what people were shooting in the 80s. But in the 90s, like I remember the types of cameras that like my dad would have, or people that I knew, were, like you said, the can do anything point and shoots. And what I've learned since becoming a collector and looking back at some of those models, even the point and shoots of the 80s were heavily limited in what they can do. When you worked with their strengths, the 80s point and shoots can take wonderful pictures, especially the ones with prime lenses. We all know that the Nikon L35, the original, had a 5-element f2.8 lens. They were putting some really good glass in some of those early point and shoots, but they had serious limitations in the types of situations they could work in. But by the 90s, they had simplified it to the point where a combination of just the right lens, the right shutter, the right metering system, the right electronics, in a small enough package that was affordable, that everybody could use. And I liked what you said about the disposable cameras too, because one of my favorite memories, what I thought was infinitely cool, the first time I ever saw it, when I was probably 15, maybe 16 years old, was going to a wedding and going to the reception, and people would put like one disposable camera on each table. And the idea is that all the guests could just take the picture. And it's funny because it's almost gone the exact opposite, where we're discouraging people from taking their cell phones and taking 80 billion pictures at a wedding. Whereas back then it was like, no, take this camera and shoot random stuff. Sometimes people would turn out obscene photos. But the idea being, if even 5 or 10% of the total images developed from that are candid stuff, the things that the professional photographer isn't going to get, that's what, brides and grooms and, people wanted to see, that they could do that with a cheap disposable camera. And I think that that's kind of lost now because everybody's posting everything on social media. It's not as spontaneous as I think it was in that decade.
Well, and what you were saying, Mike, I'm going to throw Steven a softball here. In the 80s, you had cameras, I think it was the 80s, late 80s, maybe early 90s. You had the Olympus XA, which was a great little point and shoot camera. It wasn't really a camera that everybody could use. So then they came out with the Stylus. And the Stylus was the same thing, same size as an XA, but they added autofocus. And then they added a zoom lens. And then they added a longer zoom lens. So the progression from the 80s to the 90s really brought photography back into the family pictures. What do you got there, AJ?
I'm looking at Olympus Stylus Super Zoom. Infinity Super Zoom 300. I'm just trying to see what year this was.
The earliest one that I remember that was not a fixed focal length was the Infinity Twin.
Okay.
That was a 35 or 70 or 38 to 76, one of the two. Do you remember that one, Stephen?
Yeah, that was one of those dual lens cameras that had basically like a teleconverter set of elements swing into place. And so the first thing before we had zoom were the dual focal length cameras. And then eventually we got into the continuous zoom ones.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nikon did one of those too. Wasn't it the TW20 or something like that it had the dual focal lengths?
Fuji had the TW3.
Right.
There were a few others where there was actually two different lenses that you would switch between.
Right. That was the Infinity Twin did that. You could hear it when you hit the button to move from one to the other because the lens didn't extend or anything. It was just a fixed size.
Right.
So a little an element inside would pop into place when you wanted to do that. But they were actually fairly good quality. I mean, they weren't just junk. But when it reached that point, Olympus was really a leader in what was the date on the OM4, Mike? Was that into the 2000s or did it die out in the 90s?
Which one?
The Olympus OM4.
The OM4 Ti was produced until 2002.
Okay, so Olympus really didn't have anything in the 90s, possibly OMPC, OM10, or that's earlier too, isn't it? So,
well, if we want to talk SLRs with Olympus, they dominated the 90s with their IS series.
That was where I was heading with this.
The OM4 was produced all through the 90s, and they also had the consumer grade OM 20, 30, 40. I can't exactly remember when those were produced. There was also a Cosina OM series, but these were all manual focus SLRs. Then they had like the 707 PC. There was one called the OM88. They briefly toyed with the power zoom, push by button, zoom by button, or focus by button. I've honestly never handled one, but everything I've read about them is they're quite terrible cameras. They switched around 1990 to the IS-1. I'm happy we're jumping on this so quickly because this is actually one of my favorite cameras of the 90s. I have an IS-2, and this is, I guess you could technically call it a bridge camera, but it is a true SLR. I mean, in every way, shape, or form, this is a single lens reflex camera. This one has, it's a 35 to 135 millimeter zoom. I do think that they changed that on some of the different models. This one has macro. It just has a ton of nice little features on it, but the lens is optically excellent for a zoom. It's as good as anything you'll get on an interchangeable lens system. It has every exposure metering system that you could possibly want. It's got a couple different gimmicky things too for people who are into that kind of stuff. But if I was someone who is looking today to get into film photography and I wanted to try an older camera that has still a lot of modern feel to it, I would wholeheartedly recommend the Olympus IS series. It doesn't necessarily have to be the two. That's just the one that I have. Not only because they're easy to use, they're great performers, they have excellent optics, but they're so underappreciated today that the prices for the ISs are very affordable. And sure, you can't change the lenses on them, but to someone who's new to this hobby and is just looking to get started, they're probably not going to go out and start buying a wide range of lenses. And if they do, they're probably going to stick within 35 to 135 millimeter anyway. And this just gives you that right out of the gate with a zoom lens. I really love these cameras. I did a glowing review of one quite a while, and it's something that I think is worth checking out. And if you've never played with one before, I haven't pulled them up on eBay. For all I know, they're hundreds and hundreds of dollars, but I don't think they are.
Yeah,
I'm
they're
fairly
cheap.
certain I'm fairly certain these are still, like, Paul, if a collector called you up and said, I got a whole box of Olympus ISs, you're probably not going to go driving 300 miles to go pick them up.
I actually bought from one guy. I think he was trying to corner the market on them. I bought from one guy 6 tubs of Olympus IS cameras. There must have been
Really?
30 cameras altogether. The cool thing about that Olympus, they put a lot of money into the development of the camera, but they also sold a lot of accessories.
They
I mean,
did.
they had add-on lenses, they had add-on flash units, they had macro adapters, they had scientific type pieces of equipment, cables and cords and remote controls, all kinds of stuff for those cameras, and they're all very affordable. I mean, it's a nice system camera.
On one hand, I question why they gave up on interchangeable lens SLRs and then produced one of the greatest fixed lens SLRs ever. But I guess on the other hand, that's what allowed them to differentiate. I wonder if the target customer in the 90s for those cameras might have been intimidated by an interchangeable system, but less, or I should say, more willing to consider something where the lens doesn't come off, even if it's just as advanced. I have no idea.
We've got one of the biggest Olympus fanboys here in Steven. So
Steven, yeah, I'm waiting
we've
for
been
him to
talking
jump
around
in.
Olympus, yeah, and
Yeah.
I think we really need to dive into what he
Yeah.
collects from the 90s around Olympus.
Well, I think the big selling point for those was how long the zoom was that you didn't really have interchangeable super zoom lenses. So a lot of the IS cameras were like a 35 to 135 millimeter zoom. And they're most of the IS models, you've got like an f4.5 to 5.6 lens, which nowadays we probably think of, especially as enthusiasts, as kind of slow. But a lot of the tiny little point and shoot cameras, those lenses were, an f3.5 or 4.5 to f8, f11. In some cases, you were getting f16 or f22 as they got into long zooms. And even the like disposable cameras, those were f16, f22 lenses in some cases. People really didn't appreciate lens aperture in those days, but long focal lengths were something that were appreciated. And you'd have cameras, their model numbers would be the maximum length of the zoom. It would be a 70 or a 105 or a 115, and that was the maximum telephoto focal length. Back in those days, with it being so slow and most people be shooting with a 400 speed film, I think it led to the 90s really being dominated with flash photography. You'd see the stadiums with flashes going off everywhere as these poor cameras struggle to get any sort of exposure whatsoever. But the one selling point it did give bridge cameras was to people who started to understand how little light they were getting from your average little tiny point and shoot. It did give them a little bit of a faster lens, but without being incredibly bulky. So for the somewhat informed consumer, it kind of fit in that trade-off of long focal length without being too extraordinarily slow.
It was also the versatility of the zoom, and that's still what drives what in my case what I think is the bridge market is the fact that people take off with one camera. It doesn't matter if they're doing a photo safari. It doesn't matter if they're just doing street photography. They have all the focal lengths they need.
Well, and AJ, and you, I'm sure you've seen this. You've seen this in your own stores. People
Exactly.
come in, and the first thing they wanted to know was how powerful is the zoom.
Yes.
And the next statement that you make is that's the wrong question. What
Yes.
you want to know is how low light can I shoot this picture in? People just they never understood that. They thought more zoom is better, and it isn't.
Yep.
It's if you have a trade-off.
Steven said more eloquently what I was trying to say is that I think the IS series appealed to people who wanted to step up from the simple point and shoots, but were intimidated by a full SLR system. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, rangefinders were it, but box cameras were for people who didn't have a lot of knowledge, right? Maybe the pseudo TLRs or something like that. Then the Instamatics were the effective point and shoots. And there was like a large group of people who just had no desire to learn anything. And then when SLRs started to dominate the 70s and 80s, we think of a pro camera as a Nikon F3 or a Canon F1, but to a novice, any SLR was a pro camera. Like that was just either I can't afford that or it's too intimidating for me. But I think that once the 90s hit, they were especially with bridge cameras, they were able to give most of the SLR features into a more friendly device that I thought would appeal to people who wanted a step up camera. So, Stephen, you said what I was trying to say when I was meandering earlier than that. And I feel that that's still true today in a weird sort of way. If film is making a resurgence with young people, which I still think is debatable, but if it is, and I was looking to, someone came to me and said, Mike, what would you recommend as a first film camera? I want to get into film. There's plenty of good options, but the Olympus ISs are great because they give you a familiar through the lens focusing. It's going to nail exposure all the time. It's going to nail focus all the time, or at least a vast majority of the time. And I know it's going to produce great looking images.
And like you said, it's not that expensive. I just checked 3 or 4 of them, and they're all between 25 and 50 US dollars.
I mean, in terms of what they offer, like if you were to price it based off of what they offer, these things should be on par with AE1s, and higher than that, in the sense that these things are just fantastic cameras. And these are the things that people new to the hobby should be considering, not Pentax K1000s, as much as I like those.
I think zoom lenses also hit a very interesting public perception. In the 70s, it wasn't unusual for someone to have 3 lenses. They'd have a wide, a standard, and a telephoto. And there might be some personal choices in exactly what those lenses comprised, but generally people were pretty happy with it. Then there got to be this concept of covering all the focal lengths. And people started to feel like they needed a 25 and a 35 and a 50 and an 85 and a 105 and a 135. And if they didn't have every single focal length covered, they'd have a gap that they were worried about, that they were trying to fill with primes. And as soon as zoom lenses came along and became common on SLRs, but also even more so on point and shoots, it was this idea of you've got this entire range covered. You don't have any holes or any gaps. Yeah. And for some reason, even though to people practically taking a lot of pictures, they never felt, and if they really examined the type of pictures they were taking, they wouldn't be missing out by not having that 37 millimeters available or that 38.5 millimeters available. But everyone really grabbed onto that idea, and a long zoom lens, the idea of covering all those intermediate focal lengths and then extending that zoom range further, of just having more and more zoom range, whether or not they were going to use it, it gave people that feeling of wanting the possibilities.
So sticking with Olympus, but moving on to something different. In the last episode, we briefly touched upon cameras that inexplicably develop a following and become really hot commodities, and prices escalate through the roof. We used the Canon G7X as an example in the last episode. The film equivalent to the camera who inexplicably's prices have just gone completely bonkers is from 1997, the Olympus Stylus Epic, the Mu 2. According to Wikipedia, it came out in 97, so it's in our decade. Going back to you, Stephen, what is it about this camera that people love? And in your opinion, how did it reach the lofty echelon of the most desirable influencer camera probably ever?
Well, this one's really funny to me because I used to sell these new in a camera store in the early 2000s. They were still available, still selling them, and they were a budget option. They were the cheapest one of the range because they didn't have any zoom, and you'd only really sell them to people looking for something inexpensive. Occasionally there'd be an enthusiast, and I picked up a couple for friends and for family because it was just, here's a nice fast zoom or fast fixed prime lens, fast aperture in a weatherproof camera. It was compact. It was a great option. But at the time it was ignored. It was, I can get 115 millimeter zoom. Why don't I want that? Oh, this was 135 millimeter. I want that instead. So these went from cameras that you couldn't sell used very easily and would go new for very low prices, under $100. I think at one point these were going for $90 Canadian. And now I've seen them hitting 350 to 450. Some cases, people are asking $600 Canadian for them. So it's highly amusing to me for this camera that I couldn't sell when they were new. I wish I had bought every single one I could possibly get my hands on and set them aside in boxes. But I think now it's because people have recognized that there is an advantage to an f2.8 lens, that it's going to allow them to take pictures without flash, and that it's going to be very high quality, and it's going to be a lot more useful than a 115 millimeter f22 is ever going to be.
Nick was holding up his camera. Nick, what's your feelings about him?
Yeah, this is the Stylus Epic. There was also called the Mu 2. This one is it's a deluxe kind of champagne version. It has the panorama switch on the back. I just tested it. It doesn't actually mask the viewfinder, but I think, I don't have film in here. Let me open it up. Does it mask the film frame?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it does mask. You can see that it does throw a mask on the film. So if you want to block off part of your film, it does have a panorama switch on it. The funny thing is I have a couple of these Stylus Epics, and I got them in thrift stores, maybe 10 years ago or something. So they were cheap. The one I actually like a lot is the old Stylus. I don't know why. It just feels, it's a little chunkier. It's not quite as small. The shutter button feels a little better to me. I don't know. Something about the Stylus Epic feels more like a bar of soap, like it slips out of your hands. But I might go back to that. But I do carry around the old original Stylus. That one just has like a f3.5 lens. But I mean, they're both great cameras. But I can see that, in the time when when zoom was kind of like the glamorous kind of, the standout feature of a point and shoot camera, they were not glamorous, very sought after cameras.
They also had some fairly serious reliability problems with the switch. The switch that's built into the lens cover is the activation. It's the on switch.
Uh-huh.
And it are two small, very tiny ball bearings that allow it to move in a track. And those ball bearings the whole top would come off and the ball bearings would disappear.
Oh yeah, no, I haven't had that problem. I think the tricky thing is if you try to, like when you open it, the lens pops out a little bit, and if you close it a little too fast, you run into the lens. If you
yes,
really
you
slam it closed. But yeah, if you're not too fast, it doesn't run into it.
Give it a chance to close before you light it the rest of the way.
I mean, as far as like point and shoots go, the lenses I'm sure are great, but in general use, like in daylight, I'm sure they've stopped down to at least, whatever, like something like f8 or f11. If you're in bright daylight, they're not shooting at f2.8. So you don't have, it's nice to think that, oh, I have f2.8 or I have f3.5. Even if you're in low light, maybe that's great. But yeah, in normal daylight situations, you're not shooting at f2.8 or anything like that.
Yeah, you bring up a great point about any camera that's fully automatic, point and shoot with a fast lens. The auto exposure program in those cameras rarely lets you use the lens at maximum aperture. There's that Canon AF 35ML, which is a otherwise ordinary point and shoot, but it has an f1.9 lens. I don't have the manual in front of me, but the metering program that's in there makes it almost impossible for you to ever shoot that camera wide open. It's not like you have an f1.9 lens, you're going to get point and shoot bokeh shots. You're almost never shooting it wide open. So to spend the extra money on a point and shoot with a fast 1.9 or even a 2.8 lens, you'd be surprised at how rarely you're actually ever using that. If there's a lesson that could be learned here for our loyal listeners, is that if you are in the market for the Stylus Epic and you could find one that works, great, good for you. You're going to get some wonderful pictures from it. But remember, you're buying a budget camera, and there are certainly many, many, many other options for fixed prime lens point and shoots, or even if you want to get into SLRs that are going to deliver just as good of results. While we were talking, Nick Marshall joined. Nick, thank you for coming. But we also are joined by Ira and Bob Rotoloni. Bob has been away for quite some time. He hasn't been on the show, so it's good to see you, Bob.
How you doing?
Laptop's working well. We're doing cameras of the 90s, and so far we're a quarter of the way into the show and we've only touched upon Olympus. So
earlier today, Mike and I were talking about what were the cameras of the 90s, because neither of us really remember the 90s that well.
No.
Me for one reason and him because he was young. And one of the two that we were yakking about were Canon and Nikon. Canon had the EOS series of cameras, which their Canon reps referred to as EOS stood for end of starvation, because they were finally able to start selling products again. Nikon, my feeling about it is that Nikon shot themselves in the foot. The F5 was a great camera and was a definite improvement over the F4 and a couple of things. Maybe not then, but now it is. The F4, the advantage was that you could take off that bulky motor drive and put a battery pack, an MB20 battery pack on the camera and make it much more compact. The F5, you couldn't do that. It was fixed into it, so it's a bigger camera.
So you had to buy the F100 instead.
There you go, the F100. But see, the F100 had the same problem the F4 did. In today's world, the LCD bleed and the LCD problems with it, which you didn't have with the F5. I'm not sure that was an improvement.
What's our favorite 90s Nikon SLR, Paul?
Oh, our favorite. Well, I told Mike I was going to go on a rant, so Bob can join. He may not even acknowledge this ever existed. The Nikon N70 was the most diabolical camera ever designed. It had the worst menu system on it. There are camera salespeople, who actually left the industry rather than try to demonstrate that camera to a customer. I mean, it was horrible. I had salespeople who would someone would come in and say, "Can I see a Nikon N70?" And they would say, "I've got to go to lunch." And they would leave the building. I mean, it was a terrible design.
So what was bad about it?
You had to hold like 3 buttons and turn a wheel at the same time to go into different exposure modes. Then they had program modes that were just totally useless. It was one of the first cameras where Nikon went away from a prism in the finder and went to a mirror system in order to make it lighter weight. But when they did that, they also made the view not as good. It was a terrible camera to try to focus manually. It was good autofocus, but not very good to use it with any older lenses.
I actually don't mind it. It was one of my first SLRs. And I found it quite good. I mean, the results I got from it were great, but that's down to the metering and the lenses. But I mean, I do hear you, Paul. You need to set it up the way you want to shoot, and then you don't want to touch anything afterwards.
If I'm shooting Nikon SLR from the 90s and it's not an F5, I'm reaching for the N90 or in overseas, the F90. They replaced it shortly after it came out. There's the N90S or the F90X. So, it's that kind of thing where depending on which market, it had a different name. But the N90S is a camera that I love. It does suffer from the sticky back syndrome that many cameras of this era did, but the N90 it's a coating on top of a plastic door, and you can just rub it off completely. Whereas a lot of the other cameras, when they have a sticky back, any amount of cleaning you do will eventually get sticky again. With the N90, you can just completely rub the stickiness off and it'll never come back. So I like it for that, but I mostly like it for, this was a semi-pro level camera. Obviously, it didn't have interchangeable prisms. It didn't have support for, an external battery pack or anything like that. But I mean, the N90 did have a good menu system. It supported all of the metering systems that were available at the time. It had excellent auto exposure. It had excellent autofocus. It supported the full gamut of Nikon lenses. And one thing that Nikon was doing at the time that I absolutely hated was when you used a lot of their consumer-oriented autofocus SLRs, although they do use the Nikon F mount, when you would mount a manual focus lens to a consumer Nikon AF SLR, it would deactivate pretty much all of the metering modes. So you could put a an AI or an AIS lens onto like an F70, or even the later N80 is like this too. If you put a manual focus lens on there, it turns off the metering. So it's like, why would they do that? Why would you disable the metering just because you put a manual focus lens on? Well, that's just the decision that they made. But the N90 doesn't do that. But I do like the N90 as a good test camera, especially if you're using a lot of really slow film. Because one thing the N90 can do that a lot of cameras can't is it can meter down to ISO 6, but then you can set the EV to -2, which effectively drops it to ISO 1.5. So if you have some really, really old or expired film and you just want to throw as much light as possible to it to see what you can get, the N90 or N90S or F90 or F90X are good options for that too, with its excellent metering system.
That was the last camera, I think, of the N series that took AA batteries. Yes. After that, they went into the barrel batteries, into the lithiums.
Mm-hmm. What I was going to say about when you were talking about the F4, that's the only camera you can get batteries.
Ira cut off there, but he was saying that you could get batteries at a gas station if the battery dies, whereas like a lot of your lithiums, when they die, they sometimes were difficult even then to find replacements for. So I agree. I mean, I remember even in the early wave of digital cameras, there were a lot of that we use like AA rechargeables versus proprietary lithium ion packs, and that was a nice feature to have then. So I suppose that's holds true to the film cameras as well. So I love the N90. I love the F90. I'm sure the prices on them have come up from when I last looked, but if you're in the market for an F6, a light or step down version of the F5 or F6 is probably the F100. I do not like the F100 because of the infernal battery latch, which almost always is broken. If the battery latch isn't broken, the film door latch is probably broken. If that's not broken, the entire camera is sticky. So while the F100 has an impressive feature set and can be an excellent camera, it is difficult to find in good usable condition today. Just take a look at every Japanese seller that has an F100, and I promise you the rear door is missing. And the reason it's missing is because somebody swapped out the back and or they broke the latch. So they can be hard to find complete and not sticky and working. The N90, though, is like 98% the camera of the F100. It's a solid camera. It uses AA batteries. It does all the metering modes, great viewfinder, great autofocus. I think, in my opinion, in terms of SLRs for the 90s, the N90 is the winner for me.
I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of 90s cameras haven't garnered a huge following is plastic latches. That was where a lot of things, the construction was cheapened and they just didn't last. And it's hard to find the cameras that are working to this day. And even the camera store that I was working at in the 2000s, we replaced so many broken battery doors and broken film doors on SLRs, but especially point and shoots. We would buy them in quantities of a dozen or 2 dozen at a time from the manufacturers. And at one point, we actually had a separate building that they were renting where we were storing all of these film doors and battery doors for Samsung and Canon and Minolta and Nikon point and shoots. And we'd get 3 people per day coming in with ones that had broken. And we just gather them up in the morning and around lunch, take them over to the other building and just swap these over, have them all fixed and ready by the end of the day, by the afternoon. But it was such an incredibly common problem. And in the 90s and the 2000s, when you could get those spare parts, easy to swap. Now, there's really not much option that you don't have any choice. And that availability of spare parts has dried up. But I really got the feeling like in the 90s, those cameras became kind of disposable.
If we want to stay with Nikon and talk about a camera that's super impressive on paper, but not a good investment, I can actually show you 2 of them. The titanium Nikon 2.8 Ti and the 3.5 Ti. These were Nikon's premium point and shoots. Very impressive to hold. Titanium bodies. They have this amazing Seiko analog watch dial metering system on top, which looks so cool. Like everything about these cameras should make them the most desirable collector's items and just fun cameras to own or shoot. With the exception of once they break, you can't fix them. This was one of the cameras we highlighted in previous episodes as just poor buys because the prices that they go for, if they do break, you just spend a crap load of money on a little tiny brick. But when they do work, the 2.8 Ti, it has a 7-element 28 millimeter f2.8 lens. That's gorgeous. I love the viewfinder that it displays everything. It has a little 7-segment LED that will display the camera settings. I can't go on. I can't say enough about how nice of a camera this is, other than the fact that it's a ticking time bomb. So I would definitely not recommend it. But if for whatever reason you want to go for it, and you can find one that works for a price you're willing to afford, you will be pleasantly surprised with the use of it, the feel of it. It's the bar of soap, but a metal bar of soap that actually feels like it's got a little bit of heft to it and everything. But they are, unfortunately, that's, like you said, Stephen, it's the era of plastic. Things weren't meant to last, and you just can't fix them anymore. So they are noteworthy. They're worthy of mention in a 90s episode. It's got a dial, like you would see on an SLR, but how many point and shoots have a mode dial? I think that's super cool. Again, analog dial on top, really, really pretty, but just not good investments.
Well, when you think of Nick talking about the Stylus Epic and not knowing that it's going to shoot, and it most likely wouldn't be shooting wide open in daylight, it was rare to have that kind of premium point and shoot where you could control the exposure. Minolta had them, the Contax T series. There were cameras that gave you that control, but so many of those have, if not plastic breaking off of them, it's electronic gremlins. That these are cameras that have become very desirable now, and prices have shot through the roof because you do have that manual control, you do have that high quality lens, but you have so many electronic gremlins with them that they're all ticking time bombs.
And even for the people who bought them new, I have an ad here in my review for the Nikon 2.8. The list price in 1994, so 31 years ago, this camera had a list price of over $1,200. I mean, that's insanity. Now, people didn't pay that because street prices were usually about 25% cheaper than that, but still, at the prices people had to pay back then for this premium luxury camera, they probably weren't good investments then, but boy, are they pretty.
And unfortunately, a lot of them didn't see much use because of that. They were really the premium travel camera. If you were going on a once in a lifetime vacation and you had the money to spend on it, you would get something like that as a status symbol, or as the idea that you're going to get these really amazing travel pictures. And that was not an everyday camera that people would shoot their home photos with.
And it's interesting because one's called the 2.8 Ti, the other one's called the 3.5 Ti. That's actually the focal range. They're both 2.8 lenses. So the 2.8 Ti is 28 millimeter f2.8. The 3.5 Ti is 35 millimeter f2.8. So really the difference in focal length from 28 to 35 isn't that huge. The 2.8 does have a black body, whereas the 3.5 is a champagne body. The 2.8 gives you one additional flash mode that the 3.5 doesn't have. And there's a couple other really minor differences between the two, but it's strange that they have these two models which are so similar to each other. But I will stop talking about an unobtainium Nikon camera. And I have a Konica unobtainium too, but I want someone else to talk before I continue on.
Anthony, you were doing a lot of diving then as well. And what kind of cameras were you using with diving and around diving?
By the end of the 90s, we were using HAL digital cameras, so I was using my Nikon like D100 with a Sue ball or a custom made housing for deep diving. The Nikon OS5s, that's got to be an 80s camera. The last time I saw somebody actually using one of them in water for a commercial job was probably 97 or 98.
I think a Nikon OS5 was actually a 90s camera.
Oh, I'm surprised.
I'm just looking it up now.
How many people have the perception that the 90s were almost skipped in some way, that in the 90s people were still shooting a lot of cameras from the 80s?
Well, the thing is that the cameras that were made during the 80s, especially the Nikons and the Canons, were working very well in the 90s. They were going strong. They weren't breaking down.
Yeah.
I was shooting nothing but Fs, F2s, F3s, F4s in the 90s. And I never had a camera break on me once, not once.
My 1983 Nikon FM2 was the camera that I shot through the 90s.
Yeah. The stuff just held up so well. The electronics, if you stayed away from the electronics, which I did, they worked fine. They didn't break. I had Nikon Fs I was using that were 25 years old when I was using them, and they never broke.
Correction, it was the Nikon RS that was in the 90s, not the 5.
Yes, those are unobtainium. I've never actually seen one of those in person.
I have. That's a fantastic camera.
Yeah,
they're beautiful cameras, but I've never seen one in person.
Talk about overkill.
So that's an underwater SLR, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like self-housed SLR.
Speaking of what Robert said, there were a surprising number of 80s cameras that were still produced through the 90s. The FM2 was one of them. The F3 continued to be produced up until the start of the F5. The Pentax LX is another camera that continued to be produced throughout, I think, all of the 90s, because I'm pretty sure the LX ended in like 2000 or 2001. So there was those vestiges of people still want mechanical manual cameras.
Was the Canon F1 still being made?
It probably was. Yeah, I don't know how long it was made.
That was the best thing Canon ever made.
They went to the OS in the early 90s, so but there was a little bit of carryover with the FD lenses, the FD mount.
The last new F1 was made in 92, so it did make it to the 90s, just not all the way through. But
I did a quick inventory, and I own exactly 3 cameras that were made in the 90s. One is the Minolta Maxim 9XI, which is the only autofocus SLR that I have. It's kind of a fun camera. It's very plasticky, but it's got good ergonomics. It's a good performer. But the 2 cameras that I used the most that were made in the 90s are my 2 of the very late, like last iteration of the Kyocera Contax. So my Contax S2, which is sort of like such an odd bird. It was introduced in, I believe, 92 or 93. And it's kind of Contax's attempt to make an FM2 with a spot meter. It's a completely manual camera. It has a spot meter. There's no aperture priority. There's no automation on it. It can run without a battery at all shutter speeds. It's mostly titanium. And if you want a camera that will like survive the nuclear apocalypse, that Contax S2 is the one to get. And the other is the Contax ST, which is kind of a misunderstood camera. It's kind of like the big brother to the Contax Aria. So it had 80 or 90% of the features of the very last professional SLRs. It was kind of pitched as a mid-range camera, as a prosumer camera, but it has probably the best ergonomic design. It's got an all-metal chassis. It is incredibly responsive. It takes all the Zeiss CY lenses plus all the Yashica and Cosina lenses. And it's probably my favorite sort of like all-around late featured camera that I own. I mean, I really like when I go down to shoot a launch down at the Kennedy Space Center, I'm most likely going to carry that ST with me. But it's like also a camera that nobody ever talks about. It's not a desirable camera. You can get them for around $200, maybe less. They're just it's an incredible value for the performance that you get for the price right now. They were expensive when they came out.
I have a question for you about the Contax. I recently had to return a Contax RST or RTS 2 because the glue on the mirror had let go and the mirror somehow moved forward, which means that the camera worked perfectly as long as you didn't put a lens on it. Have you ever heard of that before?
That is a common failure of those Contax SLRs. Nippon Photo Clinic in Manhattan will repair that like next day. It's the most common failure of the Contax cameras.
It's such a strange. This guy sent me a video of using my wife's hair dryer to fix it.
Yeah, I mean there are all sorts of Reddit posts on how to fix it yourself. But yeah, the mirror falling off of the mirror box is the number one failure point for those 1990s Contax cameras.
Interesting.
To be fair, that could happen on any SLR. I've seen that in any brand.
Even DSLRs, the Canon 5D has that problem.
You got to remember that precision, those are front reflective mirrors that have to be perfect. So the amount of glue or adhesive or whatever has to be so thin that they're putting whatever the absolute minimum is to adhere that mirror to the armature or whatever.
So if you leave your camera in a car during the summer, chances are the mirror is not going to be there when you get back.
That is possible. I guess that is possible, but to me, it seems more likely that it dries up and just breaks free rather than if heat is doing it, that suggests that the glue becomes gummy and it's no longer sticky. But I actually think it's the opposite to that. They just dry out and it becomes brittle, and just a bump can do it. If it takes a ding or a bump, while you're dinging around your neck or setting it down on a table, if that glue is rock hard, sometimes just a tiny bit of vibration can just jar it loose and it's done.
Mine didn't jar loose. It kind of moved forward about maybe 2 millimeters.
That's possible what the case was in yours, but I've seen it. Usually when I see a mirror that's fallen off of an SLR, you look behind it and there's this brownish, yellow, crusty remnants of whatever was holding it on before. But if it moved and it's not flopping around, then yeah, you're probably right. That's probably what it is. And that's unfortunate too, because not all of the Contax SLRs are known for reliability. The RTS2 is actually one of the better ones. You don't normally you don't normally see too many failures. Anthony has heaped praise on the S2 for its ruggedness. I have the one I mentioned at the top of the show. I had set aside a couple cameras I wanted to talk about. My favorite Contax of the 90s is the RX. This was kind of a gee whiz gadgety kind of camera too. And it's kind of like we talked like the Canon AL1, the Minolta X600 from the early 80s, where it has a focus detection circuit in the camera, even though it's a manual focus camera, and it will give you the little dot that'll tell you if something's in focus. So it's still manual focus. It doesn't have any ability to focus itself, but the RX does have focus detection in it. A really nice display, beautiful, sharp, clean lines, supports the full line of the CY lenses, Zeiss and Yashica lenses. I love the ergonomics of it, whereas some of the, like I have the Contax N1, and to me that thing's a behemoth. It's really big and clunky, whereas the RX has kind of that nice middle ground where it's hefty, it fits my hands perfectly, but it doesn't feel oversized.
Mike, if you think the N1 is good, you should get an AX. That is by far the most bloated SLR ever.
I actually do have an AX, and what's striking, you're right, Ira, that thing is monstrous, but what's striking about the AX is also how thick it is from front to back.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, because the AX is the one that has the moving focal plane, so it does autofocus manual focus lenses by moving the film plane forward and back rather than the lens. But I suppose the electronics and all the parts needed to move the film plane required the camera to be absurdly thick. Before we started the show, we were talking about the Leica R8, and I was saying how I thought that was a thick camera, and the Contax AX is similar too.
Anthony brought up the Contax S2, and I think that's one of the neat things of the 90s, was that as much as you had these gigantic cameras and these plastic autofocus cameras, there also was a period in sort of the mid to late 90s where there was a return to some of the 70s and 80s designs. Leica came up with the R6.2. There was the Contax S2. Nikon released the FM2 Titanium or FM2T. And that's when Olympus had the OM3 Ti. So these were all mechanical cameras, manual focus, in some cases built on the same chassis, or at least inspired by chassis from the 70s and 80s, that even then people were thinking, maybe this plastic autofocus isn't quite what we wanted. And there became a bit of an enthusiast market for some very expensive premium manual focus, mechanical metal cameras.
Yeah, I tell you, Stephen, you put the Zeiss 40 millimeter 2.8 pancake lens on that S2, and it's almost the same exact profile of the original 1960s Contaflex with the fixed Tessar. It's that thin, it's that small. It's actually put them side by side, and it's obvious that at some point they sat the engineers down with the 1960s Contaflex and said, "This is your design goal, is to make it this profile."
Yeah, the S2, I keep seeing people claiming that it's a built by Cosina sort of budget model. And there certainly were things like the Yashica FX3 Super 2000 and Nikon FM10, Olympus OM2000. A lot of those cameras were built by Cosina. But somehow the S2 has acquired this built by Cosina cheap camera reputation that I don't think that's true.
It absolutely is. It's an all-metal camera. It's not a plastic camera. It's an all-metal camera.
I will say, now, I've never handled an S2, and I've heard Anthony rave about this multiple times, so I 100% believe you, and I desperately want one. Looking at the prices, I got to wait a little bit longer. However, speaking to the theory that it could be made by Cosina, if all you're going by is just looks, it does have a kind of vanilla plain, like it doesn't stand out. I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think that perhaps that's why people think that, is a lot of those Cosina clones all have a generic, I don't know, like maybe you don't agree, but if all you're doing is looking at the body of the S2, it doesn't scream out that this is a high-end metal, solidly built camera.
Handling it is entirely different than seeing a photo online.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree with you.
It's a different beast. It's an entirely different beast.
I completely agree with you, and I believe you 100%. I'm just saying, based entirely by looks, it's not a camera that I'd be like, ooh, what's that? And maybe that was the intent.
If anything, it keeps the price down on the secondary market.
Yeah, not anymore. Maybe
I
it's cheaper than it should be.
$500 to $900.
Right. I know. That's what I mean. Not anymore. Maybe it went when you got yours.
Yeah.
No, I want to try one, Anthony, because I like the RX. I like the RTS2. Even the AX is cool, even though it's huge. But I would love a more mechanical metal contacts. I think I would love this camera if I had one.
Maybe we can do a hostage exchange, and if you send me back my baby Super Iconta, the 645, I'll send you the S2 to play with.
All right, deal. So you had mentioned in the mid 90s how there was almost like this slight design not regression, but retro. We're going back to like a little bit more 70s influence. And a camera that I love today, or it was either yesterday or today, is Alex Lakes' birthday. So this is a shout out to him because this is one of his favorite cameras. But the Minolta Maxim, the 650 SI, which is what it was called in the United States, it's called the 600 in other markets, and I think like the 592 or something. It's all the same camera. Now this one is plastic. It doesn't have a metal body, but it did go back to mechanical knobs on the top. So you have like a mechanical mode dial, you have a mechanical EV, dial on top. It still does have a decent amount of buttons too, but this for me, in terms of like 90s cameras, hit that perfect balance of ergonomics, features, and just cosmetics. And again, this is another really good value. As much as I'm gassing for a Contax S2, when you look up these cameras online, like a Minolta 650 SI body, I'm seeing them as cheap as $45 with a lens. 600 SI, $40 or best offer. $19.83 for the body by itself. The hand grip is completely missing though. This is a camera that it's worth looking into. It's got that nice balance of 90s technology, ergonomics, the big thick hand grip that's comfortable in your hands. It's got some mechanical knobs on the top too, so it kind of gives a little bit of a retro design, even though it is kind of an automatic camera. But this one was from 1995. Like I said, I know Alex is on the fan club with me on this. A lot of people like the Maxim 7. Paul and I had this idea of trying to fix a couple. We saw an article on Reddit or on the Discord server where they were talking about replacing the broken gears in the Minolta 7. And I tried it and I failed miserably. So I can say, at least from my experience, I have 3 of these cameras. The 650 SI, I have not had a single problem with the aperture ring breaking at all. I feel fairly confident in saying that these should hold up at least better than other 90s Maxims. Wonderful cameras, fun to use, great performers, and they support, the Maxim /Dynex /Alpha lens mount lenses.
I've got the 9XI, which is kind of the redheaded stepchild because there's the other Maxim 9 that's the one that's the, I guess, the preferred one. I don't know enough about the Maxim line to be informed about it, but it feels like it was gunning for the pro market. Because it has like a very high shutter speed.
Yes,
it's got all the features that you'd want. The design wise, it's got a little bit of the Airborg about it. It's got the
no, don't say the Airborg. No, it's terrible.
It's got the sort of swoopy plastic surfaces to it that are kind of like molded into your hand, and it's a fine camera, and it's also one that you can get for a good price right now. But it's not the first camera that I go for.
No.
One of my favorite things about the 9XI is the fact that even though it was aimed as a pro camera, it still took their expansion cards, which were kind of introduced for the other things. You've got these little electronic cards to put in to add exposure modes and features, which are mostly useless and horrible, and people lost them. But it was this crazy idea that they thought they could make some extra revenue off of selling these cards. And for some reason, this very consumer-oriented feature still made it into their pro level camera at the time.
I've got probably 12 of those cards, and I do not have the cards that I want. I keep on buying
Which
sets
one
of
are
the
you looking
cards,
for?
like the one that like leaves the film out when you're rewinding it,
Oh,
so
the
the tail's
leader?
left out.
Custom
Yeah.
function card.
And I keep on buying function cards, but they're the wrong function cards because they
Yeah.
had different cards that were the same name that did different things.
So you're saying you don't want the fantasy effect soft focus card there?
No, I don't. I've got one, I'm sure. I've got a shoebox full of these things.
I suppose from a business standpoint, Minolta could get credit for thinking up the pay by, unlock. Like Tesla, you could pay extra money to get unlock features. But the idea that a company would design a product that has the ability to do something that they purposely disable and then charge you extra to then re-unlock just infuriates me. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, it's really bad because, like you say, the camera can do what you want it to
do it,
do.
right? It's not like that card is magically teaching the camera how to do something it didn't know. It's like, no, it can do it. It's just it's flipping a register in the memory cell of the CPU that says, okay, yes, turn this on.
Oh my goodness, Mike, your Yashica Y35, the Digifilm cartridges of that cheap digital camera inspired by Minolta. Yes. Only from the mind of Minolta.
From the Minolta.
I think this one was also in the 90s. But one of those weird, inexplicable technology was the barcode reader for the Canon SLRs, right? You had to have a little light pen, like you were going to the library to check out books or something, or at like a grocery checkout, and you would scan the barcode to change that mode on the camera.
God, I forgot about that thing. That was a mess.
I do recall reading about that. That was a
Wasn't this why everybody here kind of hates the Nikon N70? Is because they put all the scene modes, all of the landscape with people and sports and faster sports and portrait and close up and beach and night scene and all these things to try and add every single feature that someone might want from a point and shoot. And really the reason I think we all love the N90 by comparison is because it's just simple. It's just program, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual.
But if you look at the model numbers, you can see where the F70 was actually aimed at as compared to the F90 or F90X, because you're starting to see the budget models, which were the F50, 60, etc., and you sort of progress. And as you progress up, you start to getting less of those consumer type gimmicks, so to speak, through to the more professional. And by the time you get the F100 and the F5, a lot of that's just all stripped away completely.
Well, and they added features. I mean, at the beginning, when you were setting the shutter speed electronically, you were working in half stop increments. And then when they got into the N90S and even the 8008S, you could set your shutter speed in 1/3 of stop increments. And that was a big deal for anybody that was shooting color slides. If you were shooting black and white or C41, it really didn't matter. But for transparency, be able to get 1/3 of a stop accuracy on your shutter speed was a big deal.
Okay, so Nick, I did a quick research while we were talking, and I'm going to give Canon some credit here on this barcode system. It's better than what Minolta did. It came out in 1990. It was made for the Canon 10S, which ironically I have, and EOS Elan 100 SLR cameras. So it's a little optional wand with like an optical reader that you had to buy extra and connect it to your camera. But they gave you a book of all the barcodes. So I think the idea is they could give you all these cool features that the camera could already do, but maybe they were worried that it was too complicated to go through a menu system. Like Paul was talking about, the Nikon N70 has an infernally confusing menu system. So rather than make it difficult for people to have to go through a complicated menu system, you would use this barcode reader to like literally scan in. It looks like a long UPC, and the camera would then set the mode based off of what it was that you scanned, and you just had a book. So although you did have to buy the barcode reader, at least then you don't then have to keep buying additional barcodes. He just gave you a book with, it says 101 Canon barcodes. So I assume it was just an easy way for a novice to unlock more complicated features without having to memorize how to go through the menu system. You would just scan whatever one you wanted to do, and it would put the camera in that mode. So still 100% gimmicky, and the fact that it only worked on 2 models suggests nobody wanted it. But at least give them credit that you just bought the thing once and you didn't have to keep buying additional cards like Anthony was talking about. but definitely a 90s dead end technology for sure.
In the 90s, you had so much feature creep, but I think Paul brought up a really good point with the third stops. One of the other things I think that developed in the 90s a lot was maximum shutter speeds. Companies are really pushing that. Does anyone remember what the maximum shutter speed of that Maxim 9XI is?
12,000?
12. Yeah.
12,000. 1/12,000th of a second.
Yeah, I use that all the time.
Do you really?
Yeah, never once. Never
I was going to say, what are you taking a picture of? And how accurate is that?
And what film speed did you have?
Yeah, no, never.
I'll be honest with you. I don't have a lot of fondness for the Canon EOS system, and it is not because I'm anti-Canon. There are plenty of Canon cameras that I love, but there's just something about their design language that Canon started with the 650, where, and this even goes into their first, second, and even third generation digital DSLRs. Every Canon SLR just looks like a bubble. In the late 90s, Ford had the Ford Taurus where every possible thing, including the radio, was a circle. And that's kind of like what I think of when I think of the Canon EOS cameras. And the design of those things are just so uninspiring. And I just, for whatever reason, I just never could find one model that I really liked, except the one and only example I have. Ira, you mentioned the EOS 1. I have an EOS 1N. This is the RS model. So it's got a little gold RS badge on the side. And what the RS indicates is that this one has a pellicle mirror. So this is the 90s evolution of that old Canon Pellix camera, where the reflex mirror does not move at all. So it constantly reflects some light up into the viewfinder while allowing other parts of the light to pass through it. And it does darken the image a bit. Right? Like I did an A/B comparison between the Canon EOS 1N and the Canon EOS 10, which does not have a pellicle mirror, using the same lens against the same light source. And the pellicle one is a little bit darker, but it's not that bad. But there is something, if you've never shot a camera with a non-moving reflex mirror, there is something kind of neat about having an SLR where you fire the shutter, you hear all the shutter noises, the click, but the viewfinder never blacks out. It's fun to shoot. I wouldn't necessarily go out and get this camera for this specific reason, but if you do happen to come across an EOS 1N and it has a gold RS badge, that's the pellicle mirror version. And the reason they sold these, the whole benefit of it wasn't necessarily to eliminate viewfinder blackout, but by eliminating the mirror having to move meant that the shutter could fire faster and transport the film faster. I believe right out of the box, this camera can shoot 10 frames per second. Digital mirrorless is obviously, when you don't have a mirror at all, you're only limited by the physical speed of the shutter. Well, back then the shutters were faster than the mirror was. So by having the mirror not have to move, allowed them to get slightly faster FPS on this. So if you were an action photographer and wanted to shoot sports and get like a photo finish, the pellicle mirror cameras were the ones that people went for.
So the Canon EOS 1N was the camera I wanted back then, and I was shooting Hasselblads and a Pentax 6.7 and a AE. That's what that's what I used. And I was like, my big move was to the EOS system, and I couldn't afford a 1N. So I don't know how much research I did. I was living in New York City, and I went and made the giant purchase of an EOS. I think it was an A2E Adorama, which was the first time I'd gone to like a giant real camera store. It's the worst camera I've ever owned in my entire life.
That was going to be my next. That was going to be my next rant. Was the A2E?
I hate that camera so much.
The A2E is their eye control. Their eye control camera.
Oh yeah,
horrible.
And the bouncing little lasers off your eye. What could possibly go wrong?
Everything about it.
It shoots a laser into your eyeball, and then as you move your pupil left and right, it's like you could go through the menus that way.
Yeah, well, you can train the focus point. So
change focus points. You can do depth of field preview.
Yeah,
there were all kinds of things you could do with it, and it never worked.
Horrible if you wear glasses.
Wore glasses, it was useless. If you wore contact lenses, it worked sometimes.
Yeah.
So between lasers in the eyeballs and barcode readers, Canon was the kings of dead end technologies.
Yeah, it was horrible. So anyway, I haven't ever got the EOS 1N yet, or the RS, which was pretty amazing. But
well, the modern Canon mirrorless camera, actually, they did bring that eye autofocus back. So that's not, I wouldn't say that's specifically dead end.
Does it work though now?
I've heard it works. I never tried it myself. Yeah.
How accurate it is when it comes to sports and wildlife, I'm not sure.
So we need someone when this episode is finally posted who has used one of the newer Canon mirrorlesses to let us know how good the eye control works. Is it better than the old one from the 90s? I'm gonna hope that it is.
I'll check it out tomorrow when I get back to work.
There you go. Okay. All right. He'll go to the store.
I'll pull one off the wall.
Okay.
I think the real test will be 5 years from now if it's still existing in any models or if they've dropped it, like the touch bar and so many other features.
Oh, yeah.
Well, like in any consumer electronics, there is always this need to come up with the next newest thing to get people to buy it. Like with HD TVs for 3-4 years when Avatar came out, everything was 3D, and then people went nutso because Avatar was like literally the only movie that looked good in 3D. Everything else was just stupid gimmicks. So then remember after that, it was curved HD TVs, like,
Yeah.
They wanted you to think that your next TV had to be curved, so they're always coming up with something. And I think that cameras are no different. They want it to be the next new thing. But back to the 90s, in defense somewhat of Canon, if you look at the design of SLRs specifically, and even point and shoots, but if you look at the first, I'll even go back to the KW Practina from 1952, right? Robert, you know that Nikon took some influence of the original Nikon F from the KW Practina. So the credit to what we had come to expect from the design of SLRs was really entrenched in the 50s. Camera design in the 60s, there were a few, tweaks here and there, but the general shape and location of the controls basically stayed the same. The 70s came, we saw a shrinkage of cameras, like the Olympus OM1 was getting smaller, the Nikon FE, the Canon A series was getting smaller. We were starting to use composite plastics instead of brass, but still the controls basically stayed the same. Then the 80s came, and all right, we're starting to get rid of knobs and replace them with buttons. So I guess there were some differences there too. But if you were an alien from another planet and came down to Earth for the first time and saw an SLR from the mid 80s and saw an SLR from the mid 50s, they would at least be able to identify that these two things are the same thing, right? So the 90s was that first time where I think the camera industry was really trying new stuff. We've mentioned bridge cameras a multiple of times. The IS-1 is definitely a bridge camera. So I think that technology, computer, CPU controlled, plastics, whatever, allowed designers to just try some new stuff. And a lot of it didn't work. A lot of the goofy shaped cameras just proved to not be popular, but we did see a lot of companies getting more comfortable with trying some crazy new stuff. And while, again, it didn't work well, it is fun as collectors to kind of look back and laugh at, Anthony's inability to leave his leader out on his 9XI because he lacks the 1 5-cent piece of plastic that enables that feature. But, it's a sign of the times. And if it didn't happen in the 90s, it would have happened in the 2000s. I'm just glad that a lot of these companies got this out of their system before the digital era came, because imagine how goofy digital cameras could have been if the dawn of the digital era occurred at the exact same time as bridge cameras were coming out.
The other part of it is, Mike, there are things that are progressions in design that we don't really think about. I mean, there's something that we can look at and say, boy, that was a stupid thing to do, but it led to something else.
Yeah.
And that's I think in a lot of ways that's what happens in these designs.
Sure.
We don't really understand because they don't really work very well, but the next generation is something that is a groundbreaking thing.
Absolutely.
I had a question. So we touched on point and shoots a little bit. I feel like the 90s was really the point and shoot heyday, or I don't know, like that was it. So what would you guys say are the top point and shoots that came out during that time?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because I have one.
I feel like the resurgence now is in point and shoots. I feel like there's so many people that are getting into film photography, and it's point and shoots. right?
I swear to God, Paul has no idea what camera's in my hand. But Paul, can you guess what camera I'm about to show?
Hexar.
Yes. I
That's
promise
my
you,
favorite too.
he had no idea I was going to bring this up. But the Hexar is literally what you just asked. This was a premium point and shoot. I don't know exactly the body construction, but there's definitely some metal here. This camera has, I'm going to take the flash off of it. I'll have some pictures in the show notes, but if you look at the back of it, it has a very rangefinder-esque design. The location of the viewfinder, mimics like an M6 or something along those lines. It's got the like projected window, like as if it's a rangefinder, even though it's not. The other piece of rangefinder DNA that this camera has, it's got a 35 millimeter f2 lens. It's a Konica Hexar, but the lens formula is an adaptation of the Nikkor 35 millimeter f1.8 rangefinder lens from the 50s. It's not exactly the same, but it's a modernization of that exact same formula, which the 35-1.8 Nikkor lens is one of the best wide-angle rangefinder lenses ever made. And that the fact that they adapted it and put it on a modern point and shoot. Read my review. I spend a lot of time going over the pros to it. It does have two. One is it's unrepairable, but the other one that a lot of people pointed to as being a horrible oversight of it, Paul, was what? The maximum shutter speed. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, 200. Was it 200th of a second?
250.
Yeah, I carried one of those in my briefcase every day for about 10 years. It's the only film camera I use that I shot color negatives in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it even has a dial on top to change the aperture. Like it has a mechanical dial for changing the aperture. It supports manual focus on a point and shoot. And while it's not great, it's better than I've ever seen done on a on a point and shoot camera. It's got a lot of really cool modes. It feels great in the hand. It makes amazing pictures. It is limited, unfortunately, to a top 1/250th. But I read an article, a press release about this camera when it first came out, is they were counting on faster speeds like ISO 1600 and 3200 speed films coming out and being much more flexible and usable than ever before. And they're trying to say that if you have the lack of a faster shutter can be compensated by a more flexible range of film speeds. Paul, you said you carried this camera for years and
loved it.
Do you ever felt like you were limited by the shutter speed?
Absolutely not, because I always had ASA 100 in it.
I'm a slow speed film kind of guy, 100. I rarely go above 200. I love 25 speed films. I love 160 portrait film, stuff like that. So I would have no problem recommending this and people paying the price it is, because in my mind, the quality of lens, the quality of construction, the feature set, the design, the ergonomics, this camera is worth what people ask for it, with the exception of if it breaks, you can't get them fixed, which is just a killer for me.
But in its defense, that's true. There aren't any parts for it, but there also aren't very many broken ones. I mean, if you compare it to the other cameras that do have
contacts,
the contacts and the X-Pan, almost all of them are gone. And the Hexar, it's not unusual to see many of them are still on the road. They still work fine.
And I should point out, they made a Hexar rangefinder too, which is a completely different camera.
This is the Hexar RF.
Right. That's a Leica M rangefinder. I'm talking about the autofocus point and shoot Hexar AF. Confusing because the names are very similar, but I'm on eBay Japan, and I agree with you, Paul. I mean, in fact, none of these are parts as is. That doesn't mean they're not still broken. I mean, Roberts has one for $919, which is ridiculous. It also, another neat feature is the black ones have the quietest shutter you will ever hear on a camera. Like, it's so quiet. Like, it wasn't that like a selling
silent
point
mode.
Of them?
Silent. You push two buttons and turn a wheel or something, and it turns it into silent mode.
Right. It has the quietest shutter ever. Maybe not ever, but I've ever heard. In fact, I actually sometimes don't like super quiet shutters because there's no like confirmation that it actually fired, but it does. So great camera. Will, I'm so glad you asked that question. It's almost like we scripted this.
My favorite 90s point and shoot, the one that I kept in my boat bag. So I'd always have a bag that would go with me on photo shoots that I would use for shooting like casual slice of life photos on the boats, was the Canon ELPH, which a tiny little camera. There's an APS version of it, not talking about that one. There's a 35 millimeter version. That's the one that I like.
What was the Canon Owl? Was that?
No, the Owl was just a plastic point shoot camera with a huge viewfinder.
Got it.
It was a cool camera. Cool camera.
I hear a lot about it, but I haven't seen one or used one.
Weren't all the elves like a metal body? Like, wasn't that the thing?
Yes. About the price of a pack of cigarettes.
I probably at one time knew that they made a 35 millimeter version of that, but whenever I think of the elf, they had the digital elves and the APS elves. So I may have to look and see if I could find a 35 millimeter one, because those are probably the least common versions of it.
I think it's the 240 is the 35 millimeter version.
The APS version of the elf, that's a fantastic little camera, by the way. That's I really enjoyed using that. It's a lot of fun.
You know, Theo, there is a camera you really like that you haven't had a chance to talk about yet.
Yeah, I was looking for the right point on that, because we've talked about advancements in technology and technology in terms of features and extending zooms and doing all that kind of stuff. But there was also, especially when you start looking at the medium format range, there was a big push in terms of technology, in terms of the quality that was coming out. I mean, wedding photographers were getting much better cameras. The 645 space was starting to fill out with a bit of automation there, but also the glass was getting fantastic. Fuji was releasing things like was it GSW 693, the big Texas Leica, which you've moved away from features in terms of technology, but the glass was just is awesome. I love using this camera just purely from the glass. But the one pinnacle of the 90s where it just blows everything else away, is they just built the best camera ever, that no one even gets close to, is the Mamiya 7. Yeah, and we all knew this was coming, by the way.
After the last episode, we were talking about how often Theo brings his camera up. On a completely unrelated slant, I wanted to go back and listen to some of our older episodes. So I actually went back to the very first Cocaine and Waffles, where it was just Johnny and I just screwing around on Zoom, where we randomly invited people. One of those people was Theo. And what camera did he mention on the very first episode of the show? None other than the Mamiya 7. So if there's one thing I will say for you, Theo, is that you're very loyal to that, and consistent too. I almost laughed at myself. I'm like, I can't believe he was talking about that camera on the first episode of the show.
Yeah, look, it's the camera that just sort of clicks with me. I mean, all jokes aside, the glass is very well known for being fantastic. It's just functional. It's light. It works really well. The metering is superb. They can be fixed still, so they're not quite in the Hasselblad X-Pan type territory.
It's a serious question for you, Theo, and I've never handled a Mamiya 7. I've never handled one in person. But what is it that is different or special to you about the Mamiya 7 that doesn't apply to the Mamiya 6? And I'm not talking the folding Mamiya 6. I'm talking the actual Mamiya 6. What is it that is different?
I don't think they're that different, to be honest, except for the format. I think they're very similar to use. The 7 doesn't have the retractable lens, which is actually probably a con rather than a plus in that respect.
Because the lens actually retracts into the body to where you can't even see the aperture, or I'm sorry, you can't see the aperture, you can't see the focus ring, and then it completely extends out.
But I do think that the lenses are a little bit smaller, so they've compensated it in that respect.
Okay.
But I just I haven't actually used the 6, to be honest. So from that point of view,
there's a chance that you might like it the same. It's just we're talking 6x6 versus 6x7.
Yeah, it's the actual format. Yeah, it's the actual format of the camera. It's a rangefinder. It's very clear. You can focus very easily on it. It's bright. The metering is just spot on. But you have to know how to use the metering on this. It is so narrow. It's almost a spot meter. So you have to really know how you're metering on the 7.
Does it have auto exposure?
On the 6. It does.
Okay.
So you can set it's aperture priority basically. So you can set it to be so you can set it to aperture priority. It just just functions well.
What's the range of shutter speeds?
This one goes up to 500.
Yeah, 500 down to 8.
Down to 4 seconds.
4. Oh, see, I can select 8. Ah.
Yeah.
I mean, I never expect them to be significantly different, but it's like I feel like I'm having FOMO with how often you talk about the 7, but I really like the 6, and I'm like, what is it that he doesn't like about the 6? But it's just that you've never had
No. I actually think about the 6 based on the specs to be very similar in that respect. I think Mamiya really hit it out of the park in terms of just building some quality rangefinders for medium format. The 6 though, I do believe are starting to run out of being able to be fixed. I'm not.
Okay.
I might be corrected on that one. So there might be a slight change in that. But the 7, it just is something that will travel really well. I'm planning on going to Japan next year, and I will be pretty much exclusively traveling with the Mamiya 7 on that whole trip. That's how much I sort of value it and trust it. But I must admit, it's a softball location too, because if it does sort of break down, I'm sure I can find a camera in Japan to do so, to keep working. But to the point, I'm actually at the point of looking at buying a Mamiya 7 Mark II as a second camera, just so I've got the 2 cameras. I've got the full range of lenses, but it is such a complete camera where, yes, I did talk about on that first episode. And then the fact that I'm still talking about it means that it still does what I need it to do. Because I do rotate through cameras quite often, and this is one that's sort of stuck to me the whole time.
I gotcha. All right, well, there you go.
About a month ago, YouTube recommended to me a video about someone buying a Mamiya 7 II and not liking it and sending it back, which immediately seemed like sacrilege to me. So I told YouTube to never recommend that channel to me ever again and reported it as false information just for you, Theo.
And so it should be.
Terrible.
Yeah, the only downside with the cameras is they're just so expensive to buy now. Yeah, you could argue to say the reason is because the quality is there and they're so sought after, and which is partly true, but it is a hard one for someone to sort of stomach without having tried one, and that's the problem. You can't go into a shop, you can't try them out, you can't do anything like that. That they are you're buying on other people's recommendations.
We have not heard from Mr. Miles Libak. Miles, you have to have some thoughts on the decade of grunge. What were you shooting then?
My first camera was in the 90s, and it was the iconic Crayola Mini, which was a 110 camera. And that's the only camera from the 90s that I've ever shot.
Okay. My first one was the Fisher-Price Kodak Instamatic. It's like blue with like thick rubber bumpers on it. So it was a 110 camera. I remember my dad would take me to like the Chicago Auto Show, and I'd take a whole crap load of pictures of that and make him develop it. So I think that was a lot of... Steven, was your first camera a 110 camera as a child?
Yeah, it definitely was.
Yeah. I don't think Robert's first camera... Robert, your first camera was a Taron, right?
Yeah, Taron PR.
See, I even know that about you.
Yeah, I still have it.
Yeah, it's on your
I
shelf.
bought it when I was in 7th grade.
Newspapers, right?
Oh, we were going. Yeah, I was working outside. $50 it cost me back then. It was a lot of money back then.
Yeah, very cool. So, what about the 90s though? What you said you were probably still shooting the F3 then?
Well, I was shooting the Fs, F2s, F3, and the F4s. Yeah, I didn't have anything digital at that. I didn't buy anything digital until I got a used D1. That was my first digital Nikon, but that would have been in 2000 something. But no, I still had my Fs. I started using Fs in '67. I was still using them all the way to the 90s easily. Yeah, I still have some.
It's good to see you on the show. It's been a while since you've been able to join us, so I'm glad to have you here.
I have a question for Robert.
Yeah.
The S3 2000 came out in 2000, but do you know when Nikon was starting to kind of, I don't know, make prototypes of that camera or talk about?
Hard to tell. I don't even know who came up with the idea, but it turned out to be a nightmare for them because they didn't have anybody who was still working for the company who could put it together. Everybody who had put these cameras, the rangefinder cameras together in the 50s and 60s and 40s, they were all retired or dead. Here they come out with this camera, this great idea. They're going to reissue this camera. They didn't have anybody to put it together. They didn't know how to do it. They had to go out and look up retired former assemblers and bring them to the factory, and they had to train people to put those cameras together because they were being put together exactly like they were during the 50s and 60s. But they got it to work. Only had 20 people doing it. They had a room with just 20 people putting those cameras together. And some of those people were like in their 80s, almost 90 years old that were helping them. learn how to do that. But they had no idea how to do it because technology had changed so much in camera making by then. It was really fascinating how they had to do that. So they were made very slowly or bench built. They're basically bench built.
They're wonderful cameras. I mean,
oh yeah.
The interesting thing about it was they offered them to us, and they just didn't sell. I mean,
No.
they just simply did not sell. And so they sent a lot of them back and had them painted black. And when they
Yes.
painted them black, then they sold.
Yeah.
And I have one of the black ones. Mike has one of the silver ones.
When they first came out, the silver ones, when the first S3 was a silver one, and even in the magazine, NSH magazine, I even mentioned, I said, why did they do that? They should have made it black from day one, okay? Because black was the in thing. For some reason, they decided to go silver. Then eventually they came out with the black version, which of course started to sell better. Then, like you said, they had to send the silver ones back, and they repainted them. Fortunately, when the SP came out a year or so later, they didn't make that only in black. They finally smartened up with that.
Is there a way to tell by looking at the serial number to know if it was a repainted one or if it always came in black?
No, I don't think so. No.
No, I think they changed the top plate.
Yeah, they just pulled the plates off. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been a whole new serial number.
Did they strip the chrome down to the brass and then paint it, or did they paint it over the chrome?
No, they probably just put new plates, period, bare plates, brass plates, and painted it. It would be labor-wise, it would have been a lot cheaper just to strip the old plates off, throw them away, and replace them with brand new ones that are painted black.
Did they struggle to sell them because they were competing against the F70?
Well, it didn't take off like they thought it would. First of all, it was kind of expensive. And second of all, the market was very limited. They didn't promote it that much either, actually, in the literature, and they didn't advertise it that much. And the dealers didn't push it that hard. But eventually, I think they did sell them all. You do find one once in a while still brand new in certain stores, maybe in Tokyo and whatever. And a lot of them have been sold that were never used. So in other words, you can still buy brand new ones off of eBay, but they're cameras that you're going through the second and third user who never actually shot with them. They just bought them as an investment. Some people thought they were going to make money on them, but they didn't.
Robert, do you remember because there are some differences. They are not exact copies.
No.
Do you remember what some of the differences are?
Self-timer lever. The paint, of course, it's a different kind of paint altogether than what they used during the rangefinder era. They used lacquer back then. I think these are more like a powder type paint. And also, most of them were calibrated in meters, whereas the ones originally were mostly calibrated in feet.
Another one I remember reading is that the film speed dial on the bottom is ISO.
Right.
Whereas the old ones wouldn't have said that. I think there's something different about the made in Japan. I think is slightly different. And then isn't the lens coating different too?
Well, the lens, of course, is also different. That's the Olympic lens. That's the lens that came on the Olympic S3. That's the last version of the 1.4. Okay. Yeah, so that's not the original 1.4 that all the regular S3s came with. That's the Olympic version. It's a very different lens. It's much larger and it's optically different.
Yeah,
much better, by the way.
Was that one of Kurt's cameras?
Yeah, it was.
I think he had like 4 of those because I got 3.
Yeah.
The one I have actually came from one of our listeners. It wasn't one of Kurt's.
Kurt sent this camera to me before any of that other stuff happened. He wanted this to come to me very specifically. So there was an S3 2000 I know I sent you that was not in the, I have the original box. So this box, but then I have the outer box that the box came in too.
Mm-hmm. Did you get the case with yours?
Case, right.
Yeah.
So you have a big box with the case in a box, and then that box has this box in it, and then you open that box, and then you get to the camera.
Yeah, and you have a lens with a hood in it also.
Yeah, the hood is right here. It's never been open.
You should shoot that camera if you haven't done it.
I haven't yet. I do intend on doing it at least once. The problem is I'm terrified to take it outside of the house.
No, shoot it. It's I really wanted one because one of my buddies from the camera store days was a really, really good friend, and he owned a progression of the black ones, and he would have it for a month and then he would sell it. And I really wanted one, and I found one from one of our listeners, and it had a couple of scrapes around the eyepiece and a couple of scrapes around the shutter lugs. And I thought, what the hell? I'm going to use it. So I've been shooting with it, and it's just a joy to shoot with.
Well, Paul, you've only visited me once, and it was that time you had like 10 minutes. You had to go. So you didn't really get a chance to stay and hang out. You've never met Robert. So next time you're up in this area, we'll carve out some time for you. We'll go see Robert. You can actually spend some time looking at the collection, and we'll load up some film in the S3.
That'd be great.
Take you for a spin.
That'd be great.
Yeah. I only live like 6 blocks from Mike, so.
Yeah, cool.
It would be faster if we didn't have to cross railroad tracks.
Right,
to
we
get
didn't have the
there.
railroad track, it would be even faster, yeah.
It'd be 3 blocks instead. So anyway, so we went through all the cameras I wanted to talk about. Does anybody have any other gems from the 90s? Any 1890s cameras? I have one. Does anybody have any 1890s cameras?
Before we go to 1890s, I do have one last 1990s. And that was the start of the digital revolution.
Oh, the Libak.
Yeah.
Yes, the floppy disk one.
Yeah.
So I mean that was obviously the start of part of a new revolution in camera making, and it's probably worth mentioning because that's definitely a 90s child.
That was the camera that single-handedly killed Polaroid.
Yeah, it did. It really did. Body shops, police,
insurance
people. Yep.
Anything kill Polaroid.
I worked at Best Buy between like 96 to 98 when those cameras first came out, and we never had them in stock. They sold for $999, and it was a gee whiz, like, wow, you could take pictures to floppy disks, but they always sold out because, like you said, Paul, it was insurance adjusters and police departments that wanted them, coroners. Yeah. It was such a groundbreaking, changing technology that the digital era was officially here. And we kind of in this episode really did skip. I mean, there were some pretty cool early digital cameras. Theo and I both have the Minolta RD175. Paul, at one time, you let me borrow that Nikon E2, which was actually like a Fuji / Nikon collaboration. Mm-hmm. Big, thick, chunky digital camera. The Nikon D1 came out in 99. I mean, if Sony was the introduction of digital cameras to consumers, the D1 was the introduction of digital to the pros.
Mm-hmm.
That changed the game. Like when I look, I actually have shot the RD175. Theo, you have too. The Nikon E2. The pictures have almost no saturation, very muted colors. They will have blown out highlights and muddy blacks in the same image. There's like no dynamic range at all. Tons of color noise. But when you look at images from the first D1, the 3 megapixel camera, it looks like a digital picture does today, just lower resolution. I mean, the quality was great. The colors were accurate. I mean, even though I was alive then, I wasn't paying attention. But that era of when people started to see what the D1 was capable of, that was it. People, like, film was dying at that moment. But here's my 1890s camera, the Kemper Combi.
Oh, wow.
It's a tiny little box camera. It's made out of all metal. It has 2 little brass things on the side of it holding it. One of them says loaded. One of them says exposed. So you're supposed to flip it depending on whether you've loaded it. It did use an early type of 35 millimeter roll film made for it by Kodak. It never got a number. So it was never like number 10 whatever. It never had a name. It was just filmed for the Kemper Combi that has not been made in forever. I tried to regular roll film on it, and I couldn't do it. So the only way I was able to shoot this camera, like film gate, is exactly the same size as a perfectly square piece of 35 millimeter film. So what I would do is I would open the back, go in a dark room, cut a perfect square of film, face it emulsion side down, close the camera, go outside, take a picture, come back inside, turn off the lights, open it up, take it out, stick it on a reel. And I did that like 8 or 9 times until I just got so tired of doing it. But I ended up with like 8 or 9 exposures from this little thing, and they look absolutely horrible, but very cool. Like there was a mask, so you could shoot either square images or round images. And I have the round mask in there because it's the closest I'll have to the original 1888 Kodak that shot round images. So these are very neat, very collectible. I love the way they look. The body has some kind of like pinstriping going on. It's like, I don't know, like a brass pinstriping on a gunmetal blue metal body.
What's the model again, Mike?
It's called the Alfred C. Kemper Combi. Since it's my trademark, you can look that review up on MikeEckman.com.
Oh, okay.
But it was patented. It's interesting because it has a patent date of December 20th, 92. So like we think 92 is 1992, but it's actually 1892. And this camera was sold for a couple years in the 1890s.
Mike, I just checked your Combi.
Uh-huh.
It's going for $493 US.
Is it really?
Yeah.
They didn't used to sell for that much. $500?
$500 US with the round mask.
Anyway, any other 90s cameras?
Yeah, I've got back here. I'm not sure if everybody can see over my left shoulder, but there's a wooden camera there. It's a studio camera. It's a 1896 Baker and Rouse
Okay.
Australian camera. It's a 10 by 12 inch, so super large format. Yeah, it's specifically made for studios. Baker and Rouse was a Australian company which made cameras, which eventually got taken over by Kodak and became Kodak Australasia. Them and Austral sort of merged. So that's a really cool camera to have. One day I'm looking at actually restoring that one because the bellows are totally ripped and shredded and so on. And actually, I've actually even got a film holder for it, so I'm ready to use it one day. But I do need to replace the lens because the lens is from the 1930s, so that's on it at the moment. So it's a nice Zeiss Tessa, but I think I want to go a bit more original and get a brass lens on there and stick it on there. But Baker and Rouse, you'll find those pop up every so often around here in Australia, and they're quite collectible cameras because obviously it was about the 19 teens where Kodak came in and they sort of went away and merged.
Very cool.
Yeah, I also have a Dalmaya camera over my right shoulder. So, I can't point very well here on the video, but for the people watching, but that's also quite a famous camera, which was actually stored in the National Library, the State Library here in New South Wales for a while. So I was quite happy to get that one as well. So I've got a couple of, old little studio cameras or big studio cameras, which are floating around from the 1890s.
We don't have time really to go over it, but I mean, we kind of skipped over APS, the Advanced Photo System. This is something we've actually spoke of on the show a couple of times before. So, I was looking it up real quick while Theo was talking. We mentioned it in episode 82 because there was a lot of development of APS that was happening around the same time as digital. And we had discussed in that episode of, did digital impact APS? Which it did. Is that a lot of people think of Advantix or APS film as being a failure. And I asserted that I thought there was a lot of very cool things about APS. I thought overall it did more things right than it did wrong. Unfortunately, its timing shortly before the dawn of the digital revolution is what ultimately killed it. If you want to learn more about Advantix film, check out Kepler's Vault 101 on my site. I do kind of a deep dive into the history of it and how it was developed. And I remember when I was researching that article, I learned a lot about it that I didn't know. And I found that there actually were a couple pretty cool cameras that used APS. There was one, I don't remember off the top of my head, but there was one Kodak model that was an APS camera, but it had a tiny digital camera in it too. It was like something called the APS preview or something like that. So you could take a picture of on film and it would have a little LCD screen and it would show you a digital image of what you just took. Now, you couldn't do anything with that information. It was just more or less a preview of, hey, this is what you just got. But it was kind of a neat example of like a hybrid digital camera, something that Steven and I were talking about recently, but that's for another show. But there was a lot of really cool things about the 90s. And, we kind of touched upon it multiple times in this show. I started off by saying that I was surprised at how many models from the 90s I really do like. Unfortunately, there's just so many great models from the 90s that would be great recommendations in cameras that I would want to shoot forever and ever. But unfortunately, once they die, they're ticking time bombs. And, there's not going to be people like Alan Wade and Yu Shin Yi and, whoever that can restore 90s cameras once they die. The circuit boards crack or the solder joints fail or the IC circuits fail due to radiation or static electricity or whatever other types of failures that they may occur on, which is unfortunate because we're going to run into that era where we're going to see a void of cameras from the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s that just won't work anymore, which is a shame because some of these are quite good. We talked about some really good values so far today. The Minolta 650 is a great option. The 600 or 507, which are name variants of the same thing. Any last thoughts before we go?
I would just maybe comment that a lot of the pro-ish cameras, like I'm shooting Pentax LX, which is probably considered an 80s camera, but they definitely made it through the 90s.
Sure. That
was like several, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that, cameras were made and still used for several decades. Mm-hmm. Like the RB67 was like a 70s camera made The later Pro SD model came out in the 1990. So that was used and made for 2-3 decades. Also, the RZ came out in the 80s. RZ67 came out in the 80s, and it was also newer versions came out in the 90s. Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. We are going to be recording 2 weeks from today, May 19th. Paul's going to be in Ireland, so he won't be there for that one, but he will be drinking some Irish whiskey, kissing the Blarney Stone on what could be his last hurrah across the pond. Hopefully, Paul, once you try to come back, they'll let you in. I will vouch for you if somehow that will help. But we don't yet know exactly what we're going to be talking about on the 19th. It will not be large format, though, so don't get excited. But that is still coming someday. But whatever it is, we will definitely get the show announcement out in a timely manner. As always, the topics and discussions on the Camerosity Podcast are influenced by you. We love all different types of people that can call us, join in on the discussion, ask questions. If you have an idea for a topic, don't tell us to talk about it. Just join and bring it up. Ask a question. Even when we have themed episodes like this one, as you can see, we can very easily get sidetracked. And actually, those are some of my favorite discussions. So please join us. Look for the show announcements on MikeEckman.com, our Facebook page, or our Discord server. Thank you guys for coming. Will, good to see you again. AJ, Miles dropped off. Bob, it's great to see you. Ira, it's great to see you. Nick,
likewise.
You guys have a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Wonderful night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
Say, that's a great-looking camera you have. Where'd you get it? No, don't tell me. One of those specialty camera shops. Wait, I'll bet it's a big-name department store. I'll bet it set you back a bundle.
Actually, no. Introducing the Nippon 35mm focus-free camera. The hot shoe is synchronized for electronic flash, a 50mm lens, and a tripod mount. It also comes with a convenient neck strap, a deluxe leatherette carrying case, a professional 50mm sunshade, and a 2-year unlimited warranty. With all these features, you'd think this camera would cost over $100. Well, think again. Call right now, and the first 10,000 customers who order the Nippon camera will also get 100 rolls of free Kodak film with purchase processing. The simple, lightweight, and affordable Nippon 35mm camera and 100 rolls of free Kodak film with purchase processing. This no-fuss camera can be yours for only $19.95.
Say, where can I get one?
Just pick up the phone and call.